Podkayne of Mars was published as a novel in 1963, and this edition on your screen is the UK version from 1970. It contains the original published ending, which is not the one that Heinlein wanted, and we will discuss that later in the video. The story is told from the first person by Podkayne Fries, also known as Poddy. She was born, raised, and lives on Mars, while dreaming of being a famous space captain and an explorer. The only exception from Poddy's narration are two brief interludes from her younger brother Clark and a lengthier postscript that finishes the book. Heinlein builds the sense that Poddy is precocious yet a touch naive in the very first page. I'm not convinced that the human race originated on Earth. This is, of course, a very Heinlein attitude to question supposed truths, to do your own learning. She is, of course, wrong, but her reasoning is considered. Among other things, she muses on the danger to humans from solar radiation on Earth and explains that surface acceleration of terror is clearly too great for the human structure. It is known to result in flat feet, hernias, and heart trouble. When she gives her age in Martian years, I'm 8 plus a few months, which is 15 or so in Earth years. Clearly, the younger seeming number adds to the sense of a childish naivety behind the intellect. But it all establishes her as a bright, thoughtful, and educated girl. It's an effective opening, and Poddy sets off as an engaging character. Heinlein's portrayal of an intellectual protagonist will be largely familiar to regular readers. This excerpt from Chapter 4 certainly reads like something Chip in Half Spacesuit Will Travel would say, but I'm not going to read that. And it's quite likely that the relationship between super genius Poddy and her super genius younger sibling Clark may well remind those same readers of the relationship between super genius Chip and the younger, precocious super genius Pee-wee from Half Spacesuit Will Travel. Poddy, though, perhaps because of her occasional bouts of innocence, such as marvelling at the idea of an ocean being deep enough to cover her head, or her inexperience in the way she believes her Uncle Tom's claims of laryngitis, makes for a more engaging protagonist. The occasional squabble with Clark and the occasional witticisms such as those on the screen add to this as well. Poddy sees through the men around her with ease and works out the best ways to stroke their egos to get what she wants. It's a shame and almost a betrayal when this determined, intelligent young girl crawls back into her uncle's lap for the comfort of a bedtime story when things get tense towards the end. It's also a touch creepy. Part of the problem here is that in 1962, the idea of a female ship's captain was, in Heinlein's mind, a preposterous ambition, yet in 2020, it really doesn't seem that way. It also seems a touch sad that 13 years after Delilah the Space Rigger was published and attacked that very same glass ceiling, that the author of that story still feels that Poddy's ambition is impossible for her. Further, it actually feels odd that he would feel that any young, intelligent and determined person could fail to achieve any ambition. That rather seems like the message of most of his juveniles. No wonder that he wrote he felt out of sympathy with the spirit of the times, but the message of this book is not aimed at the same ambitious young people as his earlier works, but instead at their parents, as we will see when we examine the ending. The diary format that Podkayne's narrative is presented in isn't without its problems either. For reasons that will soon be obvious to the uninitiated, this is not a post-event retelling in the vein of something like Wells's War of the Worlds. It's a journal that's updated as the events of the plot unfold. This means that time passes in a disjointed fashion, with updates coming after the situations are resolved enough that Podkayne has time to write about them. It can be just a little bit awkward. And the best example of this is when Poddy sicks Clark on a couple of shipboard racists, but doesn't recount the conversation she overheard, the evidence, to the reader until the next chapter. Couple that with the fact that this novel is 75% first act, and then that's undone in something of a rush. And you do have a novel that's almost entirely reliant on Podkayne's personality for any kind of enjoyment. And Podkayne is prone to speak like this. Oh, unspeakables, dirty ears, hangnails, snell frocky spit, we aren't going. At first I thought that my brother Clark had managed one of his more charlatanous machinations of malevolent legerdemain. And it's language like this that is partly what Podkayne's detractors use to load their guns. I didn't mind it. These examples are pretty rare, and I read it rather as her overcompensating for being a little overshadowed by her younger brother, who is, among other things, a super genius. Maybe I'm giving Heinlein too much credit, maybe others aren't giving him enough, but E.F. Beeler calls Podkayne the least bearable of all Heinlein's heroines, while Anthony Boucher says that she's the most delightful young girl in science fiction since Isaac Asimov's Arcade Durrell. But I think that she will start to divide opinion long before the ending comes along and splits it in two. And it is, of course, the strength of her as a character that means that ending can have any sort of impact at all. The plot is simple enough. An administrative mishap leaves Poddy with 3 new unplanned siblings and scuppers a planned holiday to Earth. The wise curmudgeon of this novel is Uncle Tom, a Martian senator who steps in with first-class tickets for the Tricorn, a cruise liner that's heading to Earth via a stop off at Venus. Along the way, Poddy ingratiates herself with the crew of the ship in an effort to further her plans to be a captain herself. She details the radiation drills, the ship's workings, and some of the characters that are travelling with them. We also get a taste of Clark's intellect, his lack of morality, when he deliberately attracts the ire of the customs officers so that the bomb he placed in Podkayne's luggage gets aboard unnoticed. During a radiation storm, Poddy demonstrates her own capability when she takes charge of and reorganises the ship's busy crash. Later, she muses on whether being in charge of the crash would actually be a better job than being the ship's captain. And while this scene draws the ire of internet feminists some 60 years later, those that complain about Poddy's sudden musings on the joys of childbirth have clearly not watched my video on Heinlein's politics. Check out the link in the description. Because for Heinlein, the proper development of young people is essential to the development and survival of the human race. Therefore, there is no higher calling in his eyes than raising children correctly, as he defines that word. A scene added late in the publishing process reaffirms that point at the end, as does Uncle Tom's retelling of the story of St. Podkayne. I never did tell you the end of it because it ends with a miracle. A proper miracle? Yes. Poddy grew up and had another Poddy, and then the world was young again. As Elizabeth Ann Hull observes, if Heinlein's female characters tend to be idealised or even sentimentalised, so do his male characters. Good people are those who keep mentally active and, above all, wish to produce and protect babies. The bomb smuggled aboard reveals a faction opposed to Uncle Tom's reaching the Triplanet Conference, and while on Venus, Uncle Tom, Poddy and Clark are kidnapped by those terrorists, with Uncle Tom then sent on his way to do their bidding while the 2 children are held as security. The children eventually escape into the jungles of Venus, getting hopelessly lost before Clark's time bomb is set off. It's to its great credit, really, that this book doesn't labour over very much, and this version, with its microscopic typeface, is barely 150 pages, so it's pretty quick and easy to read if you pack a magnifying glass. I decided to read Podkayne because I was having a discussion about it with a friend, and it was soon clear that I was confusing the book with 2 earlier stories, 1949's Delilah the Space Rigger and 1957's Menace from Earth, and the Menace from Earth is particularly similar. Partly because of my confusion, I was pretty sure that Podkayne was from Heinlein's peak era, and though he did start writing before Starship Troopers in 1958, it was actually released as his follow-up to Stranger in a Strange Land when Heinlein was moving towards rather weightier themes and tones. It is something of an outlier then, and is often considered the last of the juveniles, though initially at least Heinlein resisted the claim, which is reflected in the ending, or endings if you prefer. Now everything from here will be absolutely loaded with spoilers, so use your judgment if you haven't read it and think that you might. Now, Podkayne's narrative ends with the 2 children in the custody of Mrs. Grew, short for Gruesome, who is working with the terrorists. She has sent Uncle Tom away to do her bidding at the conference, using the children as leverage. Clark and Poddy, though, know that Uncle Tom will not be coerced and that the kidnappers have no reason to keep them alive any longer, so they resolve to escape. From here there is a postlude from Clark which begins, "I guess I'd better finish this," and he details their escape, that they successfully killed their 3 captors and split up before they fled into the jungle. Both the children got lost, even though Podkayne basically had a GPS, she lost it in an unexplained way. The bomb Clark smuggled aboard the Tricorn was set on a timer in the terrorists' camp, and it goes off, with neither child particularly far away. Clark, as the narrator here, obviously survives unhurt. Now, the original published version of the ending, in every printing or version of this book, I think as far as 1993, Podkayne returned to the camp to rescue Ariel, the baby of one of the alien captors, and is caught in the blast. Though she is badly hurt, she will likely recover. Now, Heinlein's original intent, which you can find in some post-1995 versions, for example, this one, which has both endings, and you can also find in Grumbles from the Grave, was for Poddy to die in the blast. Now, even before the internet, there was considerable debate about which ending is better, with the majority opinion being that Heinlein is the master, can do no wrong, etc., etc., and as an artist he should create art as he sees fit. Now, certainly I would agree there's some truth in that, as there is in the suggestion that there's nothing wrong with getting a second or third opinion, which Heinlein always did, valuing the opinions of his agent Lurton Blassingame and his wife Virginia above all others. My own taste, checked by yours and by Ginny's, is what I must follow. Both of whom unequivocally said they didn't want Poddy to die. Now, the next two opinions garnered, Peter Israel, who was editor at Putnam's, and Frederick Pohl, who was editor at Worlds of If, who serialised Podkayne of Mars, both also said that they didn't want her to die. Now, Heinlein's disapproval of the changes, which take the form of a couple of paragraphs added at the very end, was that his intent for the story was lost. As I mentioned earlier, this book is not aimed at a typical juvenile audience. After all, any juvenile that read Heinlein's first novel aimed at that audience, Rocket Ship Galileo in 1947, would, by Podkayne's publication in 1962, likely be thinking of raising some juveniles of their own. Instead, this is a cautionary tale aimed at potential parents, specifically mothers. And those same regular readers will know that incompetent mothers are not exactly a rarity in Heinlein either. But this particular mother he rails on because she wouldn't take the time to raise her own kids and thereby let her son grow up to be an infantile monster. His reluctance to save Poddy was that this pro-hands-on parenting message would be lost without a shock strong enough to force Clark back into the human race, and that the mother needed to get her comeuppance. The problem I see with this is that, as far as I can tell, Clark and Poddy's mother has already changed her ways. The cryo-creche mishap, which left her with 3 new babies on her hands, forced that upon her. As Poddy explains, Mother's state can only be described as atavistically maternal. Her professional journals pile up unread. She has that soft Madonna look in her eyes, and she seems somehow both shorter and wider than she did a week ago. She had been tied on the phone, telling someone firmly that while it was true, as reported, she was not leaving Mars, nevertheless she would not now accept another commission, even as a consultant, and no doubt being away from the infants for all of 10 minutes had made her uneasy, so she just had to get her hands on one of them. Mother's behaviour has been utterly unbelievable. Her cortex has tripped out of circuit and her primitive instincts are in full charge. She reminds me of a cat we had when I was a little girl, Miss Polka Dot Ma'am, and her first litter of kittens. Miss Pokey loved and trusted all of us, except about kittens. If we touched one of them, she was uneasy about it. If a kitten was taken out of her box and placed on the floor to be admired, she herself would hop out, grab the kitten in her teeth, and immediately return it to the box, with an indignant waggle to her seat that showed all too plainly what she thought of irresponsible people who didn't know how to handle babies. Mother is just like that now. So Podkayne's mother seems cured of her case of parental neglect by page 17, negating the novel's final moral that she should be looking after her children. Perhaps because he was so concerned with making sure the moral stuck, Heinlein added to the published, or publisher's version if you prefer, an extra paragraph where Uncle Tom berates Podkayne's father with, "People who will not take the trouble to raise children should not have them. You with your nose always in a book, your wife gallivanting off God knows where. Between you, your daughter was almost killed. No credit to either of you that she wasn't." And there's a lot more to Uncle Tom's diatribe, none of which seems necessary or even satisfactory, because it was his presence that endangered Podkayne, not the parental neglect. Trusting Podkayne as the almost adult that he always tells her she is, with a full range of facts, would likely result in a different outcome for her. The significance of Podkayne's death to Heinlein should not be underplayed, because, as mentioned, the continued progress and survival of the species is essential to Heinlein, so the loss of a decent young human being would be a tragedy to him, and he considered the original ending the most poignant thing he had ever written. This is from Clark's postlude. "I'm sorry about Poddy. She gave me some trouble from time to time with her bossy ways and her illogical ideas, but just the same, I'm sorry. I wish I knew how to cry. The baby fairy is still alive, and Dr. Torrance says it doesn't have radiation sickness. I call it Ariel, and I guess I'll be taking care of it a long time. They say these fairies live as long as we do. It is taking the shipboard life all right, but it gets lonely, and it has to be held and cuddled or it cries." And I do think that Heinlein's ending is quite powerful, the redemption of Clark, all the more so if you take, as I do, that Clark is trying to withhold the truth here about who exactly is comforting who in the end, We also see that this amoral figure, a borderline psychopath, willingly taking the role of mother, coupled with the line about Martians seeing gender as a matter of opinion. You could raise all sorts of questions in 1962, remember, about who and how kids should be raised, and I will point you in the direction of that politics video again, link in the description. The published version makes the same point, but I think less thoughtfully. I'm taking care of that baby fairy because Poddy will want to see it again when she gets well enough to notice things. She's always being a sentimentalist. It needs a lot of attention because it gets lonely and has to be held and cuddled or it cries. I'm up a lot in the night. I guess it thinks I'm its mother. I don't mind. I don't have much else to do. It seems to like me. Considering the lengthy nature of this debate among Heinlein fans, I'll go on record and admit that I don't like either ending very much. The last paragraph, where it hints or rams home Heinlein's message, isn't the problem. You can argue the problem is that he's already shown the problem has already been fixed, but my problems with the ending are all in that final chapter. Clark convinces Poddy that the terrorists will kill them before Uncle Tom has even reached the conference, yet without any leverage there is zero chance the terrorists will get their way. So while Poddy was convinced by his argument, I wasn't completely. That said, it is only a matter of timescales I'm arguing about here. I do think the terrorists would likely kill them, but even just delaying a little bit might be long enough for a rescue to reach them, or more likely for a resourceful Heinlein protagonists to properly plan, prepare and execute an escape. It just seems that they had more time than they gave themselves. With Clark seemingly prepared to escape well before his capture, it seems a curiously off-kilter, have-cake-and-eat-it moment from Heinlein. Their second bout of urgency is self-imposed at best, and easily rectified as well. Having killed 3 of their captors, they are alone on the site. There is time to look for ways of communicating with the authorities, for another GPS for food and water. They are expecting at some point, stretching potentially to weeks, the return of the driver, but again the only reason they have to hurry is because Clark's time bomb is set to go off. And when that's the only reason for you to hurry, how can you then claim to have forgotten to disarm it? Especially when what we've seen of him suggests he's hugely resourceful, if amoral, possibly psychopathic, certainly a genius, possibly even with an eidetic memory. He's certainly always one step ahead of everybody else in the thinking and preparation. And with only one bad guy to be wary of, the need for them to split up, as considered by Clark in the novel, is actually quite debatable. Basically, the entire postlude goes against quite a lot of what we've seen and learned about these 2 people. And while it isn't completely undoing all of Heinlein's work to that point, I didn't really find much of it convincing or satisfying. And even reading just the published version, it's quite obvious that Poddy was intended to die all along. E.L. Bleeler calls Podkayne of Mars the most disappointing work of the period, and the work of the period does contain some of Heinlein's most famous works. I do get a little bit of grief for not really liking Stranger in a Strange Land, but I wonder how many fans there are of Glory Road or Farnham's Freehold out there. If I were ranking these 5 books, I'd probably put them in this order, though I wouldn't expect too many Heinlein fans to agree with me. Perhaps I should also reread Glory Road. I may be doing it a disservice. Podkayne of Mars is certainly light on plot, but it's brisk enough anyway to not be weighed down by this, and the details of the shipboard life feel less bogged down by, well, the details than some of Heinlein's other efforts. I enjoyed the rivalry and the interplay between the 2 siblings, probably as much as Pee-wee and Chip in Have Spacesuit Will Travel, but I think the added danger from Clark actually elevates this one above that. And I think perhaps he might even have made a better protagonist himself, something of an anti-hero perhaps. But I did find Poddy engaging enough. I think some of the critics of her subservience to men are reading her wrong, and to be fair, most of the observations that she makes in that regard are probably true even today. Her changing ambitions are, in the novel, only something she's considering, and to Heinlein himself, the highest calling a person can devote themselves to. So his politics perhaps slightly intrude on the character there, but at the same time, the trauma of the radiation drill coupled with the adrenaline of her taking charge so effectively would inevitably lead anybody to reconsider their position. It's interesting to see Heinlein developing a first-person female narrator, which is a rarity in 1960s science fiction, and in that regard, it's slightly strange to see him getting criticised for it by modern-day feminists. As always, though, that's Heinlein creating and provoking thought and debate, even in a novel as brief as this. And while some might consider this lighter than his more famous offerings of the era, it is no less enjoyable for it. It's perhaps not his most accessible work, but if you don't mind the very occasional exclamation along the lines of Snell Frocky, I think there's a lot to like here. So I'm giving Podkayne, Alive or Dead, the thumbs up. I think Heinlein's original ending and the death of Podkayne is the more impactful, but it probably does detract slightly from the enjoyment of the book for most people. But then I feel like the last chapter will probably do that anyway, which is a shame because I found this to be a pretty decent effort from the Grandmaster to that point. So you've had 60 years to think it over. Should she live or die? Let me know, and thanks for watching. See you in the next one.